So, we got to go, okay, ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Jonathan, you go live, okay? Right. Just give it a minute. I'll tell you when to start.
Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you might be in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Jacqueline Passman, and I'll introduce Jackie to you in just a moment. Now, eagle-eyed viewers will notice that this evening we're doing something slightly different. Our guest, being local to Leeds, is in the same place as me, and we very much hope that that will enhance the overall quality of the event today. Now, a little bit of housekeeping. Do ask questions. You do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen, and as ever, we'll try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. There's also a chat facility on your screen, and this allows you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar should you wish to do so. Finally, we are recording this event and it will appear on our website at milim.org.uk in the next day or so. There you'll find recordings of other past events as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Jackie Passman was a teacher of Hebrew and Jewish studies at the Deborah Taylor Nursery School here in Leeds before teaching English and French in mainstream schools. She later retrained to teach deaf children. Jackie hosts regular visits to synagogues for school children and adults and gives talks in schools on the Jewish home and way of life. Jackie is editor of this book, A Cool Head in Hell, which is written by Harry Silman, who is Jackie's late father. Jackie, welcome to Milim. It's really a great pleasure to have you here with us. So, I've just mentioned that you are editor of this book. The book is out 23rd of October, in about a month, and the author's Harry Silman. So can you share with us a little bit about Harry?
Yes, my father was a doctor in the army. He was actually at Dunkirk, so he sort of went out of the frying pan into the fire when he was later captured in Singapore. And he was one of thousands of POWs in Changi in Singapore for the best part of 3.5 years. And he kept a diary, which is how this all started.
Now, when you were growing up, did your father speak about his wartime experiences?
No, we knew absolutely nothing. Well, I'm wrong. We did know Dad had been a prisoner. If we didn't finish what was on our plates, my mother used to say, your father would have been very glad of a meal like this when he was a prisoner of war. We knew he'd eaten a lot of rice. And my father had quite a sort of wacky sense of humour, so he told us he had a girlfriend called One Lung Too Few, and we believed in the existence of One Lung Too Few for quite a long time.
When did you discover, how and when did you discover that he kept a diary?
I don't think we knew about the diary at all until the 1980s. My parents took a trip to the Far East, and it included Singapore, and Dad had told us that he was going to try and visit Changi jail while he was there, which he did, and it obviously had a cathartic effect, because when he came back, I was round at their house one day and he said he had something to show me. We went upstairs, and in the top cupboard of a wardrobe, and I can still picture him doing it, he brought down this brown leather suitcase and opened it up, and in the book, I say, it was a treasure trove. There were so many things in it, including the diary.
When you say the diary,
Yeah.
was this one book, multiple books?
No, you're quite correct. There were 4. There were 3 small diaries because he had no idea how long he was going to be there for. So he started with 3 little diaries that were what I would call throwaway pharmaceutical freebies. And then when they ran out, he found what is called a bill of lading, partly used. Some of you who've worked with carbon paper in the past will know the top pages were normal thickness, then there'd be the carbon paper, and then the thin paper underneath, and his was written entirely on this thin paper. Quite difficult, because when he wrote on both sides, when he ran out of paper, you could see the writing on both sides. It wasn't easy.
And in keeping this diary, was your father putting himself in any danger, in any risk?
Oh, without a doubt. It was illegal to keep a diary. His was hidden, sometimes sewn into his mattress, sometimes, I think, under his mattress. If he had to leave at a moment's notice, which happened 2 or 3 times, he would have to get a friend to rescue the diary from its hiding place and bring it to him. So there are gaps in the diary, and then he caught up afterwards.
When did you feel there was potential for a book here?
It's an interesting point, is that, because Dad never thought it would be of interest to anyone. But after this time, when he got the diary out, at about the same time, a friend of his, a fellow prisoner of war, and his story is actually in the book, Jim Bradley, he wrote about his experiences, and in the letter he put in the book, he said, you should really publish your diary. He knew Dad had kept a diary. So at that point, Dad dictated to me a small portion of his diary that he thought might be of interest to the general public.
So we'll get into the detail of your father's experiences in a moment, but just looking at the role you undertook with this book as editor, were there any particular challenges you faced? And I suppose you will have had the information that he wrote down at the time, but then also later information, either that he had provided or I suppose other people like the gentleman you just mentioned.
Yes.
So presumably that was a challenge, but what other sorts of challenges did you face?
First of all, anybody who's tried to read a doctor's handwriting will know it's not very easy. The writing got smaller and smaller when he realised his incarceration could be longer. When he wrote on both sides of the paper, it wasn't easy to read. But there were times, it wasn't just illegal to keep a diary. The most heinous crime was to have access to an illegal radio. And the parts of the radio were kept in the hollow legs of the bamboo chair in my father's medical room. And they heard news of what was happening in Europe. And every so often in his diary, he had written about something in Europe. And then afterwards, he realised that if the Japanese got hold of his diary, it would show that he'd had access to an illegal radio. And he cut little bits out. So you can imagine trying to work out what might have been said on the little bits that were cut out was not very easy.
So what else did you need, and where did you find this other material?
Right. I've obviously tried my best to fill in gaps. There were a lot of medical terms, and I relied on my brother to help me with those. My daughter is very good at deciphering the words that I couldn't read. We'd look at a word and try and work out what it was. And really, the diary is the main focus. But I have read other accounts, and one of them in particular, written by one of my father's, was very friendly with the Padre, and the Padre's daughter published her father's diary, smaller diary, but there was information in that as well. So I had a few different sources.
Well, we'll talk about the Padre hopefully a little bit later. When you first read these diaries, did you see a different side to your father than the person you thought you knew?
Yes. My brother and sister and I had absolutely, really no proper idea of what had gone on. It was quite a shock, quite a revelation. We knew a bit, obviously. We'd seen some of the war films that were on television. Dad always said these war films sanitised what actually happened. And it did open our eyes to what actually happened there.
So let's talk a little bit about how Harry became a prisoner of war. You said he was in Dunkirk, or
Yes.
at Dunkirk.
Yes.
What happened? What happened next?
Well, he was with the BEF in Dunkirk, and actually even the story of Dunkirk was interesting, because as they were loading the soldiers from the beaches, the soldiers were some of them part buried in the sand with their heads above the sand. And when Dad was driving a lorry, he'd commandeered a lorry to carry sick soldiers to the boats, and he had to swerve as he was driving to avoid these heads in the sand. And what he did say, the noise and the flashes of light, it was really quite striking. But after they got away from Dunkirk, his division were actually in training for a while, and then they set sail from Scotland, and a very long roundabout route, because they couldn't go anywhere near Europe because of what was happening within the war there. So they went the coast of America, and they finished in South Africa, in Cape Town, just 2 days after Pearl Harbor was hit. And then they were rerouted. They were thinking, I think they were going to go to North Africa or somewhere like that, but they actually were then rerouted to Singapore.
Okay, so how did he become a prisoner?
They were in Singapore 10 days, and it's before the capitulation to the Japanese. Churchill had always said Singapore can't possibly be overcome. It was the most well-defended place in the world, and he was wrong.
But as a medic, being a prisoner of war, did that give any advantage to your father?
Yes. Advantages and disadvantages. Advantages as an officer anyway. The officers certainly had better sleeping accommodation than the what we call the ordinary ranks. And he had a medical room. And the main advantage for him, certainly before they were sent up country on the railway, was that he... Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Yes, it gave him work to do. It gave him a purpose. And whereas there was a lot of boredom, a lot of people got into fights and arguments, Dad had something to do with his day. And however tired he was and however many people he saw, he at least had some satisfaction in what he was doing.
And he seemed pretty settled in the camp he was in, but then of course they were moved to build the railway.
Yes.
And I think it's fair to say there was a marked deterioration in the conditions, and indeed in his condition through that time.
Yes, they had, I wouldn't say an easy life initially as a prisoner of war. Their food was very poor in the main things they needed as far as things like vitamins were concerned. But they did have a comparatively comfortable life, if you can call it a comfortable life. But when they set off, they had a 5-day horrible train journey in a cattle truck. They were packed like sardines. It was very hot. And then a 200-mile trek through the jungle, which by all accounts was just unbelievable, before they arrived. And he was part of a group that was sent to the most northern part of the railway. So they have the longest trek.
One of the things, one of the themes, I would say, of the book is food, or the lack of it. And in many entries, Harry is writing about what they were given to eat, and obviously then as the food becomes more scarce later on, this becomes an even bigger obsession. What was your father's attitude to food post the war? Do you think that experience left a mark on him in any way?
Well, he certainly never turned down anything. You know, he told us we should be. He never used the word grateful, but he said just eat what you're given, and he certainly wasn't fussy. And he still liked rice. That was the most remarkable thing. He had and he liked curries. It didn't stop him from enjoying some of the food that you would have thought it had a surfeit of. But yes, it definitely, I think it made him appreciate what he had.
Now, what about religion? Because you told me earlier that your father had come from a very orthodox Jewish household. How engaged was he with Judaism, and was he able to practice his faith while he was incarcerated?
Well, before he was taken prisoner, I actually think that he had a few years away from the family, and I don't think religion had meant a lot to him then at all. But once he was taken prisoner, it clearly made a difference. And within 2 weeks of being of the surrender, he'd actually organised a Friday night service in a hut, in a little hut. There weren't many people there to start with, but gradually he got services going. I wouldn't like to give the impression he was the only person to instigate a Shabbat service, because the camp was huge. There were thousands of prisoners from different divisions of the army. But where Dad was, he was the person responsible initially for setting it up. So yes, that was something that we found interesting.
Now you're going to read
Yes.
for us something about this
Yes.
from the book.
Yes, the very first Shabbat, which, as I say, was barely less than 2 weeks after they were taken prisoner, attended my first army religious service. Strange that it should be as a prisoner of war. I was the only officer, one sergeant, one corporal, and about 16 ORs, that's the other ranks. No one had a prayer book, so we had a short stand-up service, 3 men, each reciting a bit of a prayer that they could remember. The service was held at 8 p.m. in a rubber plantation behind some distant billets. We couldn't sit down owing to the ants.
Wow. At one point, and this I think is probably one of the most memorable paragraphs in the book, you describe how your father lost some films, or he described how he lost some films, and also within sentences of that, burning some of the diaries he'd written.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about that, and was he able to reconstruct what he'd lost, what he'd burned?
Right. He kept a diary, and he said he used the word conscientiously, a diary for the whole voyage from the UK to Singapore. And when he arrived, he was so concerned that the Japanese might use it to find out information about the British Navy, about the American Navy who'd accompanied them down the coast of America, that he burnt them, and he was never able to reconstruct those at all. What he did do, just before capitulation, he said that he walked to a sort of hillside top and could see the Japanese advancing, and took cinefilm and still photos of it happening, and he wrapped them all up in a canvas bag and sewed the bag, and he climbed at midnight into, there was a little mosque with minarets, and he pushed the bag as far back into the dome of the minaret as he could. And before he went up country, he thought he would rescue them. And when he went, they'd gone, and he was really upset about those. It was obviously very valuable footage, and that was lost forever. He mourned the loss of the films more than the camera.
Do you think all this experience had a long-lasting effect on your father? And do you feel you in any way have been influenced by what happened to him?
We were very lucky because our father was a very positive person, and he obviously was able to compartmentalise his experiences, put it in the past and look forward. I do know that for a lot of people this wasn't the case, and although I wouldn't like to suggest in any way what happened to the prisoners of war of the Japanese is relatable to what happened in the Holocaust. It's a terrible fact that if you look at the ordinary prisoners of war in Europe, only about 4% died. If you look at the prisoners of war in Japan, 27% died. And that was just due to the atrocious conditions, the torture, the lack of food. So for a lot of people, they had the most terrible memories. And can I just read you?
Yeah, please do.
When they were coming back on the ship, and I only found this out comparatively recently, they were issued with a notice. I can just maybe show it to the camera. Guard your tongue. You are free now. Anything you say in public or to the press is liable to be published throughout the whole world. You have direct or indirect knowledge of the fate of many of your comrades who died in enemy hands as a result of brutality or neglect. Your story, if published in the more sensational press, would cause much unnecessary happiness to relatives and friends. If you hadn't been lucky enough to have survived and had died an unpleasant death at the hands of the Japanese, you would not have wished your family and friends to have been harrowed by lurid details of your death. This is just what will happen to the families of your comrades who did die in that way if you start talking too freely about your experience. So they were forbidden to talk about it. And you can imagine the people who suffered from PTSD. And we know this, as I say, Padre's daughter actually interviewed a lot of families who suffered not just the immediate generations, but it was passed through generations.
Now let's talk a bit about Padre, because he was a great friend.
He was.
Of your late father. Who was he? What was he doing there?
Well, Padre accordingly, like my father, was attached to the division as against being a regular soldier. And this is something I learned, is that different battalions were assigned a medic, a doctor, and a padre, who each had a role to play. My father had medical orderlies who had had basic first aid training, nursing training, but for some of them, they hadn't done anything until they actually were taken prisoner, and then it was passed on to them by other people there. So there was one doctor and one padre, and I think they found a friendship because they each had a role, and they just got on really well. They used to talk well into the night, discussing everything from politics to religion to what was going to happen in the war. And what is really nice is that I made contact with his daughter only a few years ago, and we've become friends as well.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Now, we've got a few questions coming through from our audience, and anybody listening and watching who has a question, please do type it into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to ask Jackie everything you want to know. And we've got a couple of questions from Jay Prosser. Jay has been a previous guest on Milim and is a regular viewer, and he's interested to know what regiment your father was in Dunkirk and then later in Singapore.
He was in the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, the 9th RNF. You might, if you're aware of the geography of England, wonder why a doctor from Leeds should be with the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, but there were no openings for a medical officer in any of the Yorkshire regiments, which is why he was sent to Northumberland.
Okay, and Jay is also interested in your father's attitude to the Japanese. He says from his family's experiences, they never forgave them.
Yes, it took, well, Dad didn't want a Japanese car. I think eventually my mother, I think she got a Honda, but to start with, he wouldn't consider a Japanese car. And what happened, Emperor Hirohito came to England, I think in the 1980s, and quite a few of Dad's regiment went, lined the street, and as Hirohito was going through, they deliberately, and there were quite a lot of them, turned their backs. He found it very, very hard to forgive the Japanese because they were so cruel, and he that's all he saw in them for a long time was the cruelty in their faces.
Jay actually says, oh my goodness, my mother escaped on the ship that brought in the Northumberland Fusiliers. Did he arrive on the Felix Rousseau?
Absolutely.
Well, there's a
Yes,
coincidence.
that is. Yes, the Felix Rousseau was the ship that brought him in, and they did take civilians away. Yes, absolutely.
Fascinating.
Yes.
Well, and we've discovered this through Millim.
Yes.
We have a question from Janet Stowe. How did the prisoners of war spend their day?
Well, this was a major problem for the prisoners of war, was boredom. Meals were the highlight, but meals only punctuated the day just so far. There was what was called Changi University, and they were quite strict. You had to have a highish level of education to go, but there were people with who'd been, say, lecturers in specific subjects. They actually had quite a good university going, which gave people chance to learn languages, law, theology. Another thing that kept people very well occupied were the shows that were put on, because with such a very big prison population, there was a wealth of actors, musicians, people who could make scenery, and they regularly put on shows. And there were books, they pooled their books for a library. There was a lot to do for those who wanted to, but some people found it hard. I think there were quite a lot of petty arguments until people settled down.
Now, you've got some more things here with you. You've got the prayer book, the Siddur that
Yes.
that your father used. Maybe you can show that to the
Is that there?
to there.
Yes. This little prayer book was given to my father by a Dutch rabbi, Rabbi Nussbaum, who came into the camp about 8 months after they surrendered. And when he came in, he actually revolutionized the services, because he knew when all the Yom Tovim were. So they had a Rosh Hashanah service, Yom Kippur. When it was Seder, he was very imaginative with how they could make a Seder when they had very little. And my father carried this little prayer book throughout, and there's a dedication from the rabbi inside it.
Why don't you read us the extracts about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur,
Yeah.
which may well be on people's minds at the moment, given the time of year.
Absolutely. The first day Rosh Hashanah, and this was the first Rosh Hashanah in captivity, he did have 3. The first day Rosh Hashanah, last Saturday, we had a record attendance, nearly 50 being present. Owing to the limitations imposed by the prayer book, it's difficult to give a true service, but we managed to put bits and pieces together, and all in all, it worked out very well. We're trying to get more English into the service, as the Aussies are not the very religious type. I think that an anglicised service would go down better with all concerned. But then, when it was Yom Kippur, yesterday was the most remarkable Yom Kippur I have ever spent. We had 2 services, a long morning one and a shorter afternoon one. There were over 70 present in the morning, including a few RAF newly arrived. We read a portion about Isaac in English, probably the Rosh Hashanah Parsha. Our Palisha cantor put a lot more wailing into his voice in a vain attempt at Chazanus. There were about 10 officers present, many of whom I've never seen before. One of the men asked us if we could finish by 12:30, as they had to be back by 1 o'clock for dinner. A few observed the day strictly, but those that didn't can be forgiven, for it was terrifically hot and sweat was pouring out of us as we stood listening. We had a little Nilla service, but didn't have the usual shofar blowing. I wonder whether in England there'll still be the same stream of cars after the service, and whether Mam gets her annual headache. It's at times like this that one thinks of one's family and vice versa. We're not having a sukkah this year, but we'll have plenty of palm leaves for a lulav.
We have a question from Penny Coit, and she's mentioning a name, Eric Cruikshank, another medic at Changi. Is that a name that rings a bell with you?
It definitely rings a bell. I have come across his name, but my father, as I say, was the medical officer for his division, which was about his battalion, which varied between about 600 and 800 men. So they used to have meetings of all the medics of all the different areas regularly. There was a Changi Medical Society, and I'm absolutely positive my father came across him, because I seem to remember the name. The diary is a very long diary, and if I haven't seen it there, I've definitely seen it in one of the other books I've read.
Now, you mentioned that your father had been on this trip to the Far East. Did he go to all the places he had been previously?
No, but he only went. He didn't go into Burma, but he had arranged to go around Changi jail. It's not very easy to clear, I think, that Changi prisoner of war camp was a huge area. Changi jail was a prison building within the camp. And Dad was given permission to go into the prison, which is now a civilian facility. And my mother said when the doors clanged behind them, she felt really weird, and I think Dad did as well. And he found his cell where he'd been kept.
Oh, really?
Yes. Haven't changed much, I don't think, in 40 odd years. And that's when I think that set him off on the journey of starting to reread the diary and tell me about it.
And what about you? Have you visited, or do you have any plans to visit?
I have visited when I was in Singapore. There's a very nice museum in the Singapore airport is on the site of the prison camp. It's called Changi Airport, and there's a very nice museum there from the time. And in fact, there is a cross there that the Padres family took from one of the Padres churches. I did go with my daughter and granddaughter to Japan, and I had very mixed feelings about going. But one of the places we went to was Nagasaki. And obviously I have an ambivalence towards Nagasaki, because I'm confident without the atom bomb dropping, none of my family would be here. I don't think any of the prisoners of war could have lasted out for years. But when you see what actually happened there, it is just devastating. And does the end justify the means? It was a horrible experience. And the Japanese were unbelievably not forgiving about it, but there was no blame. It's a very, very good exhibition. I think Hiroshima is the same, but there doesn't seem to be any blame attached to the United States or any country. They just say it as it is, and you go away with little origami doves of peace.
And you say in the book that the war in the Far East is far less known than the war in Europe. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think part of it is that they weren't allowed to talk about it. So I don't know. I was quite recently, there was commemorations for VJ Day, 80 years on, and I was with my daughter. We went down to the National Arboretum, and they were talking about the Forgotten Army, and this phrase, the Forgotten Army, came up again and again, that people tended to forget about what the war in Japan still continued months after VE Day, and there were people still dying there. But I think it was because Europe was near, and once it was over, there were celebrations, and they felt it was like an anticlimax coming back again. I don't know.
There's a comment from a viewer called Alan Silman. Is he a relative?
Yes.
Well, he says Eric Cruikshank's son is a friend of
right.
his. So we're making all sorts of amazing connections.
Right. Well, that doesn't surprise me, Alan, at all.
With this programme.
Yeah. For those who don't know, Alan is my brother.
Okay. So tell me, what surprised you the most in creating this account of your father's experiences?
Oh, that is a good question. I think the ingenuity of my father in particular, but just everybody in general, how they kept themselves occupied for 3.5 years as prisoners, coping with very petty tyranny of the Japanese, coping with very insubstantial meals. They did have meals, but they were missing so many vital ingredients, and there were so many I think there's at one point in the book, my father said he wished people in England realised the value of vitamins. We take it for granted, and so many diseases that people were dying of simply because of a lack of vitamins. It's unbelievable.
So the book is titled A Cool Head in Hell.
Yes.
Where's that from? Is that something from the diaries, or is that something that
No.
you've thought of?
No, to be honest, my publisher, when they read the book, just felt it described my father, who did keep a cool head. There was one time, his worst time was looking after cholera patients when they were up north where the railway was being built, and he was single-handedly looking after 400 cholera patients. And I don't know how he could do that day after day, but he just kept going, doing what he could. He had very little in the way of medication, but just did what he could.
So, you've edited a book,
Yes.
you've told a story.
Yeah.
What's next? Are you planning to write anything else or publish anything else?
Possibly, but it would be something very different from this. So we will see. Watch this space, as they say.
Ruti Roche asks, did your father treat the Japanese as well as the prisoners of war?
Yes. I don't think that he did a lot of that, because I presume they had their own medics, but I do know he definitely treated one Japanese officer because he was so grateful. He arranged for my father to have a medical room that he didn't have. And so whether I'm not quite sure how it happened, because my father certainly had his hands full with the British prisoners of war that he was looking after, but he definitely had treated at least one Japanese officer, for sure.
Well, thank you for sharing your story with us. This book is published on the 23rd of October in hardback. I believe it's out on the 9th of October on Kindle. It's really a unique account, and it explains through short diary entries and your very clever interweavings of narrative what happened and what this wonderful and quite unique man managed to do to help people really against the odds. We have a little something for you, book of photographs.
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much.
To say thank you. We hope you'll enjoy those. Now, just a few words about our upcoming programme. Our next event is after all the festivals, and it's on the 20th of October. Author Charles Harris will be speaking about his new comedy crime novel, Play Me, and this is a finalist for the 2025 Page Turner Awards. The following week, we welcome Tamar Hodes. Tamar has recently published a short novel called Mixed. This is a family saga about two sisters, one who marries in and one who marries out. This book was longlisted for the Comedy Women in Print Award. And then on the 3rd of November, we welcome back Harry Freeman. Harry is something of a Millim veteran, and he'll be speaking about his new book on Bob Dylan. So to book for any of those events, please visit millim.org.uk, and you can sign up to our newsletter. That way you'll be sure you're the first to hear about whatever we are presenting. All of these online events are free, but you can make a donation to help with our costs. Please see our website for details. It remains for me to thank our guest, Jackie Passman, once again. Thank you, Jackie. Thanks to Simon Marcus, who has ably assisted with presenting this live stream this evening and recording it for future views. Looking forward to seeing you all next time. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.